We now come to the statement on the economy update. I'm going to call the Chancellor of the Exchequer to make a statement with up to 10 minutes, and we're going to run this for 1 hour. I'd now like to call the Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Mr. Speaker, thank you for giving me the opportunity to update the House on our economic response to the coronavirus. And let me say at the outset, I'm grateful to members from all sides of this House, including the Honourable Member, the new Shadow Chancellor, for their contributions to this debate. Mr. Speaker, we should be in no doubt about the seriousness of the economic situation. The Office for Budget Responsibility have published a scenario showing that the coronavirus will have very significant impacts both at home and in the global economy. More than 1.5 million new claims have been made to universal credit. Over 4 million jobs have now been furloughed, and survey evidence suggests a quarter of businesses have stopped trading. These are already tough times, and there will be more to come. And while our interventions have saved millions of jobs and businesses, we can't save every job and every business. I understand and I share people's anxiety. But right now, the most important thing we can do to protect our economy is to protect the health of our people. As my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, said this morning, we are making progress. We are beginning to turn the tide. But if we lose control of the virus again, we risk seeing a second spike, which we all want to avoid. So the goal of our economic strategy is to provide a bridge over what will be a sharp and significant crisis by keeping as many people as possible in their existing jobs, supporting viable businesses to stay afloat, and protecting the incomes of the most vulnerable. In other words, to maintain the productive capacity of the British economy, so that once we are able to refine the public health restrictions, we can, as quickly as possible, get people back to work, businesses reopening, the self-employed trading again. The OBR have been clear that if we had not taken the actions we have, the situation would be much worse. The IMF has said our approach has been aggressive and right. And taken together, I believe our response has been one of the most comprehensive of any country anywhere in the world. Working closely with the Bank of England, business groups, trades unions, banks, charities, and many others around the country, we have developed a plan to protect public services, people, and businesses. Let me address each of those areas in turn. Mr. Speaker, public services like the NHS are on the front line of the fight against coronavirus. And I repeat today, whatever resources our NHS needs, it will get. At the budget in March, I announced a coronavirus emergency response fund, initially allocating £5 billion. We've now provided over 3 times that initial amount, with the NHS and public services receiving £16 billion so far. We're also providing extensive support for people's jobs and incomes. Our most important and far-reaching policy is the Coronavirus Jobs Retention Scheme to keep people in employment. The scheme launched on schedule last week, and I'm pleased to report that the first grants have just been paid. Around 500,000 employers have already applied for help to pay the wages of over 4 million furloughed jobs that might otherwise have been lost. HMRC are also on track to deliver the Self-Employed Income Support Scheme, as promised, in early June, and we will publish detailed guidance this week. Alongside these new interventions, we've strengthened our existing safety net with increases to universal credit, the local housing allowance, and statutory sick pay. And we've reinforced our social fabric too, with £750 million for the charity sector. Of course, the best way to support people is to protect their jobs, and that means supporting the businesses that employ them. Our plan to help businesses means the following. Almost half of all business properties in England will pay no business rates this year. Almost 1 million business premises can now receive cash grants of up to £10,000 or £25,000. Over 2 million businesses have been offered a VAT deferral, saving them an average of £30,000. Another 2.7 million people will be able to defer their self-assessment payments. Almost 60,000 people and businesses have put time-to-pay arrangements in place with HMRC. Up to 2 million employers will be able to access the statutory sick pay rebate, up to £48,000 per firm. Over £14 billion of lending has been issued through the Bank of England's financing facility. Over 20,000 coronavirus business interruption loans have now been approved. And of course, all of this is on top of our furlough scheme, with payments now arriving. Taken together, our plans are protecting millions of people and businesses across our country through a set of interventions in the economy on a scale we've never attempted before, and they are working. But, Mr. Speaker, I know that some small businesses are still struggling to access credit. They are, in many ways, the most exposed businesses to the impact of the coronavirus and often find it harder to access credit in the first place. If we want to benefit from their dynamism and entrepreneurial spirit as we recover our economy, they will need extra support to get through this crisis. Some businesses will not want to take on more debt, which is why our focus has been on cash grants, tax cuts, and tax deferrals. But for others, loans will be part of the answer. So today we are announcing a new microloan scheme, providing a simple, quick, easy solution for those in need of smaller loans. Businesses will be able to apply for these new bounce-back loans for 25% of their turnover, up to a maximum of £50,000, with the government paying the interest for the first 12 months. My Right Honourable friend, the Economic Secretary, and I have been in close talks with the banks, and I'm pleased to say that these loans will be available from 9 a.m. next Monday. There will be no forward-looking tests of business viability, no complex eligibility criteria, just a simple, quick, standard form for businesses to fill in. For most firms, loans should arrive within 24 hours of approval. And I've decided for this specific scheme that the government will support lending by guaranteeing to the lender 100% of the loan. And let me address this point directly, Mr. Speaker. I've heard some calls for government to underwrite all our loan schemes with 100% guarantees. I remain unconvinced by the case for doing that universally. We should not ask the ordinary taxpayers of today and tomorrow to bear the entire risk of lending almost unlimited sums to businesses who may in some cases have very little prospect of paying those loans back, and not necessarily because of the impact of the coronavirus. So I do not think it is appropriate to provide 100% guarantees on all of our schemes. Instead, these new bounce-back loans carefully target that extraordinary level of state support at those who need it most. And the 50,000 cap balances the risk to the taxpayer with the need to support our smallest businesses. Mr. Speaker, right now, the most important thing for the health of our economy is the health of our people. We are making progress in our fight against the virus, but we are not there yet. So our strategy is to protect people and businesses through this crisis by backing our public services and NHS with increased funding, strengthening our safety net to support those most in need, and supporting people to stay in work and keep their businesses going. Our response is comprehensive, coherent, and coordinated. It is, I believe, the right approach. And I hope I can continue to rely on the support and advice of all honourable and right honourable members as I commend this statement to the House.
Can I now welcome the new Shadow Chancellor, Annalise Dodds, with 5 minutes to respond. Annalise Dodds.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I'm grateful to the Chancellor for advance sight of his statement. I'm also very grateful to all the Treasury, civil servants and those working in HMRC and DWP who've been working incredibly hard to get these schemes running. I fully appreciate that the Chancellor's job has not been an easy one. Nonetheless, it is our job as a constructive opposition to point to problems that we're hearing from the front line and to indicate solutions. And it appears that at least some of those problems are more acute in our country than in many others. The Purchasing Managers' Index figures that came out last week indicated a sharp fall in business confidence, and that sadly wasn't a surprise. It's been clear for some time that the economic slowdown we're currently experiencing is sharp and deep. It was, however, unsettling that those figures suggested that business confidence has taken a stronger hit in the UK than across the Eurozone. I've heard from small business owners who put their life and soul into their firms, but they've less than 2 weeks of cash flow left and they're devastated. We all need to work together to get the different support schemes working for our country. We must fix this. Now, I'm well aware that many of the conditions for shifting out of lockdown are not within the Chancellor's grasp. However, there are matters where his government needs to be open about blocks on progress and how it will remove them. That applies to the test, track and trace regime, which must be in place before key sectors can open again. It also applies to the creation of a national tripartite system to ensure workers and employers have confidence that they can return to work safely when the right time comes. The Chancellor is directly responsible for the economic package, and he knows we supported him in creating the furlough scheme, for example. Indeed, we called for it. But the evidence is that some other key elements of the economic package are failing. So in a constructive spirit, I want to ask the Chancellor whether he would countenance solutions in 3 areas. First, CBILS. It's a relief to hear from the Chancellor that he's listened to calls from this side of the House, business and others, that we need a full guarantee for at least some loans. He's stated up to those of £50,000. But we need to be clear the UK has an enormous mountain to climb in this area. Switzerland has a population of under 9 million, yet it approved 4 times as many loans within its first week than the UK has done in a month. We're running out of time, so can I ask the Chancellor how he'll ensure the bounce-back loans get to those businesses that need it? How will they get out of the door? And what plans does he have to ensure the capacity will be there in banks to provide those loans? Second, recent figures suggest 1 in 10 in our workforce looks set to be unemployed as a result of this crisis, with all that entails for people's future prospects, incomes and their families' health. Again, I say to the Chancellor, we will work with him. We've indicated many of the gaps within existing schemes to protect incomes and will continue to push for these to be filled. However, we must be clear. The reason why those gaps are such an income-crushing, insecurity-producing crisis for so many is because the only alternative to coverage by these schemes for many is in most cases universal credit. Universal credit which pushes people right down to an average of 10% of the income of the rest of the workforce. The DWP has made some welcome changes, but failure to change the initial loan into a grant threatens to create even more of a debt crisis among households. Apparently, the government is sympathetic to changing the loan into a grant, but we're told the computer system just won't allow it. So my second question is, will he knock heads together and get the computer to say yes to switching UC loans into grants? Finally, as he knows, before this crisis, we had an economy which for so many simply did not work. Around a quarter of all families lacked just £100 in savings, even before the crisis began. The UK is the most regionally unequal country in Europe, and we've just had the longest squeeze on living standards, not just in a generation, but in 8 generations. The recovery from this crisis must be faster and wider. To ensure as many people as possible have a job to come back to, we need a flexible furlough scheme. The Chancellor told me previously it can't currently be made more flexible, but other countries have done this. Will he work to amend the furlough scheme to allow workers to come back on a part-time basis? And will he do as so many other countries are doing, from Germany to New Zealand, and talk about how those hit hard by the crisis can be supported, not just now but in the future as well, with employment boosting, redeploying and retaining schemes. The aftermath of the pit closures tells us that an approach where the government shrugs its shoulders will scar our economy for generations to come. So my last question is, will he work together with me, trade unions, businesses and local authorities to develop a plan to offer the hope of work to those who have already become unemployed and get our economy moving again?
Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I welcome the Shadow Chancellor to her place and thank her for the constructive dialogue that I've had with her over the past 2 or so weeks. And let me address her questions directly and swiftly. Firstly, with regard to the loan guarantee programme about the bank's operational capacity, obviously this is something that both the Economic Secretary and I have spent a lot of time on over the past few weeks, working with the banks. I'm grateful to them for re-engineering their entire systems to offer this brand new bounce-back loan. I am assured it will be available from next Monday morning. It will have a very simple application process, and the banks will not have to conduct more than customary fraud anti-money laundering checks, which of course would be reduced on existing customers that they have. If you have an existing business account with the bank, it should prove incredibly rapid, and within a day or two you should have cash in your bank account. They are readying their systems for that launch date as we speak. With regard to Switzerland, and I hear this a lot from many commentators that we should copy what they did in Switzerland, Mr. Speaker. Now, it's worth bearing in mind Switzerland do have 100% guaranteed loans. I absolutely agree that they do. It's worth bearing in mind that Switzerland also don't do very much else in the way of direct fiscal support for their businesses. And indeed, after extensive dialogue with the Swiss government, it is very clear that for them, the loan guarantee scheme is the primacy of their direct fiscal support to businesses. In this country, we have done tens of billions of pounds in direct cash support through tax cuts, through reducing business rates, through cash grants of £10,000 or £25,000, to paying people's statutory sick pay bill. These very direct cash impacts, I believe, are more generous than asking companies to take on a loan, which is why I believe the Switzerland comparison is not analogous. And secondly, the Switzerland furlough scheme requires employers to contribute a fifth of the payment to the scheme, whereas in this country, our furlough scheme removes that very considerable cash burden from businesses. So as I always say when I'm at this dispatch box or answering questions elsewhere, Mr. Speaker, it is important to look at the totality of all our economic interventions. When measured as a percentage of GDP, it is very clear to me, as has been empirically shown by others, that the sum total of our fiscal intervention to support businesses and people through this crisis is one of the most comprehensive and generous in terms of scope and scale anywhere in the world. Turning to the next question around universal credit and support for the most vulnerable, I firmly agree, Mr. Speaker, that during this crisis we must, of course, look after the most vulnerable in our society. And from the budget onwards, I have strived to do exactly that. We have invested extra funds into tax credits, into universal credit, improved eligibility to statutory sick pay, improved the employment support allowance, improved how these schemes work for self-employed, improved the local housing allowance, and indeed created a brand new hardship fund for local authorities to help people with their council tax bills. All of these investments have sum total of over £7 billion of investment by this government to strengthen the safety net to help the most vulnerable in our society through this difficult period. And lastly, with regard to the future, I wholeheartedly believe that the best way out of this is to ensure that as many people as possible can return to the job that they had. That is the best way to protect people, to protect their livelihoods, their families, their household incomes, which is why all of our support has been conducted with that aim in mind. How can we help support businesses? How can we help them to keep their employees attached to that business? I believe that our furlough scheme stands at the centre of that. All the other interventions will help support that aim, so that as we emerge from this crisis, Mr. Speaker, we can bounce back as quickly as possible to the life that we once knew.
We now go across to Theresa Villiers. Theresa Villiers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government's support package for jobs and wages is providing a vital lifeline for millions of families. But every day the full lockdown continues, further damage is done to the economy. So can I ask the government to publish a roadmap to release from the lockdown so that businesses can start to prepare for a phased modification and a safe exit from the current emergency measures?
Chancellor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I agree with the honourable member that, of course, the economic damage that is happening at the moment is severe, which is why we've taken the unprecedented measures we have to try and mitigate as much of that. And of course, I share with her, and indeed the Prime Minister, as he said this morning, shares with her, a sense of urgency to want to restart our economy, not least so that we can get people back into work and enjoy and start creating the tax revenues that we need to pay for our public services. But we are not there yet, and that is why we must remain disciplined and united around our aims and meet the test that we have set to emerge from this phase of the crisis. But the Prime Minister also said this morning that we are making considerable preparations and have been for a while for phase 2. And in phase 2, as the Prime Minister said, we will be able to gradually refine our economic and social restrictions and one by one fire up the engines of our vast UK economy. So I can assure my right honourable friend that that work is ongoing. I remain committed to it. And as the Prime Minister said, the government will be saying much more about this in the coming days.
We now go across to Alison Thoulas, the SNP spokesperson, with 2 minutes. Alison Thoulas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Chancellor for advance sight of his statement, and the SNP welcome the money that he's committed. We acknowledge, however, the gaps and the limitations and constructively ask for particular actions in a number of areas. Firstly, the assistance for those waiting for the confirmation of a universal claim, the ending of the 5-week wait and the 2-child limit, additional support for carers who may be forced to stop work, a support for those caught in the New Starter furlough gap, support, as the Scottish Government have already put in place, for those who are newly self-employed, support for limited company directors who particularly feel as though they have been left out, removing the no recourse to public funds conditions which leave people without support in many cases, and helping asylum seekers whose support networks may have fallen apart, ensuring that pregnant women wrongly sent home on statutory sick pay and unpaid leave in March get access to the furlough scheme. The Chancellor talks of supporting viable businesses to stay afloat, but that viability is very much in the hands of the banks who are making decisions on tight criteria. So I ask, what is he doing to ensure fairness in that assessment? The bounce back loan scheme he announces is good, and deferring can be useful, but many small businesses feel that this just stores up debt for the future. It's understandable that they may not want to take on more debt. So I ask him, will he look at more grants, at CBILS overdrafts and revolving credit to help those businesses through the current difficulties? Will he also look at assistance for food wholesalers who are keeping care homes and small shops in supply at the moment and are suffering due to the downturn in hospitality? He makes no mention in his statement of the many businesses who shut their doors on public health advice and now find that their insurers are refusing to pay out in business interruption claims. Will the government step in to cover disputed claims because businesses just do not have the time or the money to go through the financial ombudsman services or through the courts? Thank you.
Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the honourable member for her constructive engagement with both me and others as we go through this difficult time. To turn to her specific questions, firstly, with regard to, again, I think helping the most vulnerable, there have been several different measures that we have put into place that will help many of the people that she mentioned, not least strengthening universal credit, as we have done by £1,000 over this year, and associated change in tax cuts, and providing discretionary fund to local authorities to help those in their communities who they know better than any of us sitting here who are in most need of support. And that will cover perhaps many of the groups that she talked about. With regard to the banks and viability tests, what I can tell her is that this new scheme, the bounce back loan scheme, will not ask for any forward-looking information from companies. It will be a very simple form for companies to fill in. It will be self-certification, and the banks will be doing customary fraud and money laundering and identity checks rather than any credit checks, given our 100% guarantee. So that problem should be solved. I've also spent time talking to the banks, as has the Economic Secretary, tirelessly on a daily basis about the other forms of credit that they are extending to small businesses. And she is right to point out that some businesses would prefer to have things like overdrafts. And in that vein, I'm pleased to tell her that the last numbers I had were that about 20,000 new overdrafts have been extended, together with about 60,000 capital repayment holidays. And of course, there is general SME lending that happens outside of CBILS or indeed our new bounce back scheme. But I can assure her that the Economic Secretary and I remain alight to this and will keep up all necessary pressure on banks to make sure that credit flows to where it needs to get to. But today I'm happy to put on record my thanks to them and their teams for helping us work at pace to get the bounce back loan scheme up and running for next Monday morning. And lastly, she asked about insurance companies, and I think she's right to highlight this. I would point both insurance companies and their policyholders to the very strong guidance set out in a letter by the FCA, which urged insurance companies to behave responsibly and flexibly with regard to the interpretation of their policies. We've made it very clear previously that where a policy, there was a question about whether it should pay it out depending on whether we had closed the business or not as a result of government action, that was cleared up. Of course, very few people have policies that would cover them for this, but where it is clear that they should have a reasonable expectation of coverage, it's right that the insurance companies pay that out, and we will keep a close eye on that situation.
I'll go over to Andrea Ledson. Andrea Ledson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I say I congratulate my right honourable friend very sincerely for the bounce back loans. I think that's going to make a huge difference to small businesses. And also say how great it was to see the Prime Minister back in good form today. Of course, we need to keep the lockdown in place until such time as it can be safely lifted. But will the Chancellor today give employers and entrepreneurs, who are the lifeblood of our economy, the reassurance that when restrictions can be lifted, they will be given some notice and some very clear guidelines so that they will be able to restart their supply chains with confidence?
Chancellor.
I thank my right honourable friend for her comments, and she knows better than most, having held the positions that she's had in government, the importance of business to our economy and driving our economy. She's absolutely right. Businesses will need time to prepare. As I alluded to, work is already underway in government, engaging with business and unions and others to make sure that when we are in a position to get to phase 2, to refine those social and economic restrictions, work has already taken place to prepare everyone for that and give them a suitable amount of notice so they can kickstart the engines of our economy.
We go over to Sir Edward Davey. Sir Edward.
Can I welcome the micro loans scheme, but can I press the Chancellor to do more for the self-employed, in particular self-employed not in his scheme, many of whom have only modest incomes like cleaners, builders, taxi drivers, musicians. Such self-employed people often work through limited companies, relying on dividends for income and are getting little or no help, with devastating consequences. I know the Treasury is worried about fraud, but I wrote to the Chancellor on the 8th of April with a Lib Dem proposal to help these self-employed people and protect the taxpayer. So will he please now help these self-employed people dependent on dividends before it's too late?
Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I mean, the right honourable member mentioned groups who actually I engaged with specifically in the design of the self-employed scheme, and I am fairly certain on the day it was released reasonably positive comments, notably Taxi Drivers Association and I believe one of the musicians' federations as well. And I spoke to them both personally as we developed the scheme, and I believe that they were very supportive of the time. Mr. Speaker, we've designed these schemes at pace in order to get support support to as many people as we can in the time we have available. The decisions we've taken enable that, and at this point, complicated changes to those schemes would just mean that we would be able to delay getting support to millions of people who are either already in receipt of it or very shortly about to receive it.
Steve Bryan.
The package of help for those self-employed is welcome, and it does help the vast majority of these workers. However, there are those in the group, not the super rich, left out because they either own over the 50k cut-off, they're new to self-employment, or their company directors not earning the majority of their income by this route. So in the spirit of doing whatever it takes and appreciating the fact that it could well involve some element of pay now, claw back later, can the Chancellor just give these workers some hope that he doesn't view the self-employment support scheme as a done deal, and as Scotland has shown in recent days, he's still open to new ideas?
Chancellor.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I hope I've demonstrated over the past 6 to 8 weeks, I'm always open to new ideas, whether at home or abroad. I've constantly sought to refine, to improve, to iterate, to respond to circumstances on the ground to make sure that our economic response is as comprehensive and effective as it can be, and I can give my honourable friend the assurance that I will continue to do just that.
Matt Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Businesses in Warwick and Leamington, much as across the country, have been burning through cash in recent weeks and have been desperate for a cash injection. I welcome today's announcement by the Chancellor, but does he not accept the view from Neil Kashkari, who ran the US federal bailout program in 2008 to 2009, that what is critical is actually getting the money out as quickly as possible and as simply as possible, as the French have done with lending 7 times more than the UK, or the Germans 3 times more? Does he not accept we've been too slow and too deliberative?
Good. Chancellor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Different countries have done things in very different ways. He talked about the US there. The US has no equivalent of our furlough scheme, which is actually probably the most significant economic intervention that we've put in place. It was up and running 4 weeks after I announced it and is already getting money to businesses as we speak to pay wages. He talked about other European countries. There's a range. We have now issued more C-bills loans than the equivalent scheme in Germany.
Sir Graham Brady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we look ahead to a gradual lifting of restrictions on business in the coming weeks, will my right honourable friend look for common sense opportunities, such as allowing open-air markets to trade in the same way as supermarkets? And will he also look at changes to the furlough scheme to help it to accommodate a gradual return to work?
Chancellor.
I thank my honourable friend for his thoughtful comments, and I know he's put a lot of personal time and energy into thinking about these things, and I welcome his engagement with me. I think he makes very interesting suggestions. As the Prime Minister said this morning, there would be gradual refinements to the social and economic restrictions, and he is right to highlight that that's exactly how the process will work, whether on the restrictions or indeed on how we remove some of the economics of interventions that we've put in place.
We now go over to Angela Riedel. Angela Riedel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think all the House will welcome the Chancellor's announcement of his micro-loan scheme, the bounce-back loans, which he's just made in his statement. But will he also admit that the C-bills loans that he announced are still proving slow and overly complex and bureaucratic? And will he look again to see what he can do to simplify that scheme so more of the £330 billion of potential loans that he set out in his first announcements can actually get to where they need to be to save huge swathes of our economy?
Chancellor.
The honourable member is absolutely right. I am striving to make the process as seamless as possible and as quick as possible. We made some improvements a couple of weeks ago, removing guarantees, changing some things on the back end, which I think has already made a difference, and there are now over 20,000 C-bill loans that have been issued. There are 40,000 applications that the banks are working through. The application rate remains high, over 80%, or the acceptance rate. But there are further tweaks that we have been putting in place over the past week. Information on that will be outlined later. It is largely technical and administrative and regulatory, but I believe those changes will continue to accelerate the pace of C-bills loans, and I share with the honourable member that that is an aspiration we all share.
Steve Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to congratulate my right honourable friend on the wisdom and skill with which he's adopting policies that I'm confident are not naturally his territory. So really well done to the government. I want to ask him, will he reassure me that he is conscious we need to take early safe opportunities to open up this economy if we're to get back to a path to sustainable prosperity? And can he reassure me that he knows how to unwind this major set of interventions so we can get back to sound economic principles?
Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, as ever, my honourable friend makes excellent and informed points on economic policy. I thank him for his support as well. He's absolutely right. I share with him, and indeed, as does the Prime Minister, a sense of urgency about wanting to reopen our economy so that we can start driving growth, providing people with employment and paying for our public services. He's right to acknowledge that that must be done safely. And although we have made progress, we are not there yet, but I can reassure him that extensive work is underway to plan for phase 2 of this crisis so that we can get back to the economy that he and I both want to see.
Peter Callum.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the last 10 years, there's been a very active debate about those relatively few companies who have so aggressively avoided paying tax in this country. Many of those same companies are now relying on the largesse and generosity of taxpayers in order to remain solvent in these difficult times. As the Chancellor and his department starts to plan for the recovery economy, will he take this opportunity to have conversations with those companies to make sure that when we do recover, they play a much fuller part in our economy going forward? Let's aim for not business as normal when we get back from after this crisis. Let's aim for business as better.
Chancellor.
I thank the honourable member for that comment, and I like his phrase at the end, which let's see if it shows up in a future speech or not. But no, he's absolutely right. Look, we are all in this together. We have gone through this as a collective endeavour as a country, whether business, government, individuals, and it is right that during this process people act responsibly, and that's something that I've urged all businesses to do, and I hope they continue to do that. And he's right that as we emerge from this, that it's right to look at things in the round. As we went through this together, we must repair the economy all together.
Anthony Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to congratulate my right honourable friend on the bounce back loans, which I'm confident will provide a lot of relief to a lot of small businesses in my constituency. And also I'd like to congratulate him on the strong support measures across the range, which I know has helped a lot of people in South Cambridgeshire. But can he confirm that he'll keep the package of measures under review, both to identify any other groups that we can help, but also to make sure that as we transition out of lockdown, that we do so successfully? In particular, the job retention scheme, which, as you said, now employs 4 million people, has been very successful in protecting jobs. But we need to make sure that when it does come to an end, it does so in a way that minimises redundancies.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is well informed on these issues, and I know he has put a lot of specific thought into this topic, and I welcome further engagement with him. He's right, we must think carefully about exiting these schemes to provide maximum support to the labour market, to businesses, to ensure that we don't inadvertently distort things and actually hamper our recovery by stopping people from going to work, for businesses, for re-employing them, which is the outcome that we all want to see.
Howell Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Friday, the government announced support for ferry services between Northern Ireland, Scotland and England. The Holyhead-Dublin route was ignored. A great deal of the Holyhead-Dublin traffic is in fact between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, including the transport of time-sensitive goods like food and medicine, and it is also vital to the economy of North Wales. Is the Chancellor just standing back and waiting for Holyhead, the UK's second busiest roll-on, roll-off ferry port, to fail before stepping in?
Chancellor.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as we've demonstrated, we are prepared to support critical transportation services in this country with huge economic intervention in rail, in buses, and indeed, as he acknowledged, in ferries. I know my honourable friend, the Transport Secretary, is well on top of this, and he will bring to me any issues that he thinks need my consideration.
Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Chancellor and his teams for the speed with which they've managed to get so much money to help so many of my constituents. As he thinks about how he is going to balance the black hole that is his budget at the end of this, can I suggest that he consider not only ending the fare fuel stabiliser now that oil prices have fallen so much, but also looking at a windfall tax on those hedge fund managers who are currently selling short the very businesses that he is trying to support?
Chancellor.
I thank the honourable honourable friend for her support. Although I can't comment on future budgets, I will certainly hear what she has to say and re-echo what I said to the honourable member opposite earlier, that we are all in this together as we look to repair public finances and get our economy going after we exit this crisis. It's important that everybody from every part of society plays their part in that.
Who would have thought of virtual Jim Shannon? Jim Shannon!
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. Yes, virtually, but here at a distance. Can I thank the Chancellor for all that he has done, is doing, and indeed will do for the future. Those in the hospitality sector, and in particular private bus companies, who don't have premises fall just outside the present small business support scheme. Would the Chancellor agree to extend the scheme? And similarly, the coronavirus bank loan scheme has had 36,000 applications. Only 16,000 have been approved. Again, would the Chancellor ramp up their underwriting cover from 80% to 100%, as other countries have been doing?
Chancellor?
Well, Mr. Speaker, what I'd say to the honourable member is the new bounce back loan scheme today does come with a 100% guarantee for loans of 25% of turnover up to £50,000, particularly given the structure of the Northern Irish economy that he knows so well, which is full of micro businesses. I believe this in particular will be a very significant intervention that will help the Northern Ireland economy.
Felicity Buckley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to congratulate my right honourable friend on the scale and breadth and speed of the various packages. Thank you for that. Would you agree with me that what is important at the moment is getting cash and liquidity to businesses and to individuals, and hence why the micro loan scheme is so important? Would he also agree with me that over time a lot of these companies are taking on additional debt, so we may have to think of debt equity recapitalisation?
Chancellor?
I think my honourable friend is absolutely right, and I know she spent a lot of time with businesses in her constituency understanding what's on their mind. Cash and liquidity is king, which is why the VAT deferral in particular that we put in place, worth over £30 billion, 1.5% of GDP, which took effect some time ago, is so vital in providing that breathing room. These new bounce back loans will be available to businesses hopefully within a day or two of applying, which will also speed up cash, and the furlough scheme is now up and running, and people are getting that cash in their bank accounts as we speak.
We now go over to Alan Brown. Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many workers in low basic pay rely on commission to make up their wages, but if they're furloughed, they only get 80% of their basic pay, which causes real hardship. Now, in response to my committee question, the B Secretary says he's actually considering this matter. So will the Chancellor write jointly with the B Secretary confirming a solution will actually give these workers access to 80% of their typical earnings?
Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, at this point, it is very difficult to make changes to the operation of these schemes that would just delay further payment. For those workers who have fluctuating wages, for example, those on 0 hours contracts, we have provided employers and employees the ability to take either the most recent time period and look at that over a year before if they were seasonal, or indeed to take an average of their earnings over a period to make sure that they're not inadvertently penalised by a shorter period of lower earnings. I think that does provide flexibility and generosity to those who do not have fixed amounts of work.
Over to Stephen Metcalfe. Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I thank the Chancellor for all he is doing to protect jobs and income in this really difficult time, and especially the introduction of the jobs retention scheme. However, he will be aware that many companies don't initiate a payroll run until the end of the month. This means that new starters in early March who have been paid for work that they've done in March, but then have been laid off because they're unable to access the furlough scheme. Will he review this and consider other evidence of employment?
Mr. Speaker, when we announced the job retention scheme, I said that it would apply to those who were known to HMRC on the 28th of February. That was how the scheme was designed and set up. What we were able to do over the course of the last few weeks is move that date to the 19th of March, which brings in an extra few 100,000 people into it, and means overall that now around 30 million, just shy of 30 million people in employment are able to benefit from the furlough scheme, which I think is an extraordinary achievement for the team in HMRC to have conceived in this short space of time.
Going over to Daisy Cooper. Daisy Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pubs and restaurants have been hit particularly badly during COVID-19. Those with a rateable value of more than 51,000 don't qualify for the Retail, Hospitality and Leisure Grant Fund. 6 of the big pubcos are still charging their tenants rent, and now pubs are being told they'll be some of the last to reopen once restrictions start to lift. So will the government commit to extend the Retail, Hospitality and Leisure Grant Funds to properties with a rateable value of up to 150,000? Will it instruct the big pubcos to stop charging its pubs rent? And will the government commit to extend the furlough scheme for as long as pubs and restaurants have to remain closed, or for as long as their income are affected by social distancing measures?
Chancellor.
Thanks. The honourable member is absolutely right that companies in the retail, leisure and hospitality sector are the most hardest hit during this crisis. Of course, they can avail themselves of all the various interventions we've put in place more generally, but the one specific benefit they have, for most of these businesses, rent is a significant part of their cost structure, which is why we have given them a complete business rates holiday for this entire year.
Julie Marson. Julie Marson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The economic package that my right honourable friend has put in place is historic in its scope and ambition, and has been an absolute lifeline to so many people in businesses and in Hertford and Stortford, and the bounce back loans will help still more. But would he agree with me that there are some, mainly larger businesses, which are entitled to taxpayer support, but which do not need it and so have not taken it, and that we should applaud the lead they have taken and encourage others who do not need it to do the same in the national interest?
Thank my honourable friend for her kind comments and say that I agree with her. They should be applauded. As I said earlier, as we go through this crisis, everyone has their own role to play, and they should play that role responsibly. And I'm glad to see, whether it is individuals, whether it's government, whether it's businesses, everybody taking that advice to heart. And she is right that those businesses that have done that do deserve our praise. But more generally, as I would say, we are trying to support workers remaining attached to their jobs, and I will try and do that in as broad and as comprehensive a way as I can. But those businesses, she's right, they deserve our praise.
Stephen Farry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Like others, I am sceptical that we will see a V-shaped recession followed by a sharp recovery, with some sectors and some regions struggling more than others. So does the Chancellor accept the need for some form of future economic stimulus to restart the economy? Surely it's simply not just a case of restarting the engines on the economy. The economy may need a bit of a push.
Chancellor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the most important economic policy at the moment is to maintain productive capacity of the UK economy during a period of shutdown. Our interventions are designed to preserve as many businesses, as many jobs and as many connections as possible. That's the best way to ensure that the recovery can be as strong as we would all like it to be, and that, for the moment, is where we will focus our attention.
Andrew Selous.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very grateful to the Treasury for the amount of work it's done to try to keep the economy going. However, I do have a tourism business and a leisure business which have been turned down by their banks, even though they are both viable, and they will need more than the £50,000 of the bounce back scheme announced by the Chancellor today. These are excellent businesses which we mustn't lose. So will the Chancellor continue to look further at cases like this and consider possibly some grants where there are very difficult situations?
Chancellor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Without knowing the particular details of those businesses, for many businesses in the retail, leisure and hospitality trade, they'll be eligible for cash grants of £25,000. Also, all businesses can use the furlough scheme, which is significant. There'll be business rates holidays for those businesses, and indeed the statutory sick pay rebate scheme that I announced earlier will be up and running next month, which will allow businesses to apply for a rebate on their statutory sick pay bill for up to 14 days per employee. That could benefit businesses businesses of up to £48,000 as well. I hope all those packages put together provide some relief to my honourable friend's business and many others.
Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Chancellor rightly stepped in to do the right thing by many of our businesses as COVID-19 hit our economy. But is he aware that there's a small group of people who took on pub tenancies between the last eligible date he set in the grant rules and the lockdown? I have 3 in my constituency. It's a sizable financial commitment, and even more so when you then can't trade for the foreseeable future. Can he look again at the rules and assist this small number of people now in limbo with no access to help?
Chancellor?
Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to look at the specific situation that the honourable gentleman raises. I would caution it is difficult to make changes to these schemes. As many members have said, the importance is now getting cash out to people. The only way to do that is to let these systems run as designed. But I'm happy to go and have a look at the issue that he raised.
John Lamont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I congratulate the Chancellor and his team at the Treasury for everything they are doing to support the country during this very challenging time. But can I ask the Chancellor, in relation to Scotland and Barnett consequentials, how much extra funding has flowed to Scotland as a consequence of his announcements, in particular in relation to business support that he's announced? How much extra funding has come to Scotland as a consequence of that?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend is absolutely right that when I say we are all in this together, I mean every part of our union, and this government is steadfast in its support in getting through this crisis by supporting and working very closely with all members of our union. I can tell him that from the budget onwards, £4 billion in Barnett consequentials have been provided to Scotland. £3.5 billion of that relates very specifically to the range of announcements relating to our response to coronavirus, and that those numbers are in addition to the UK-wide measures that do support business, like, for example, the job retention scheme as well.
We go over to Angus Brendan McNeill.
Happily, Mr. Speaker, I hope you're all doing well there overseas in London. Last week, Mr. Speaker, a member of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee said that monetary financing for financial fiscal spend with central bank money rather than government bonds is something that central banks are always doing. Direct funding of governments by their own central banks is therefore a fact. And can we remember the words of the late American economist J.K. Galbraith, who said the process by which money is created is so simple, the mind is repelled. Therefore, can the Chancellor take this opportunity not to repeat the socially divisive policy of austerity? As coming out of this crisis, the last thing any of us need is another round of austerity.
Mr. Speaker, what I can tell the honourable gentleman is rather than commenting on monetary policy, it was obviously not my place to do, is that we are determined, as I've said, to preserve as much of the productive capacity of the UK economy as we can through this crisis. Those are the interventions that will ensure that we can bounce back as strongly as possible, recover as much of our potential output as possible, and hopefully then put us in a strong position to carry on delivering on the agenda that we set out at budget, spreading opportunity to every part of this country, levelling up through investments in education, infrastructure and ideas.
Steve Double.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As has already been highlighted, the tourism and hospitality sector is going to be the hardest hit through this lockdown. And as we're unlikely to come out of lockdown very soon, it is going to need further support. So can the Chancellor reassure the sector that he will consider further support for tourism and hospitality? And will he particularly reflect on the seasonal nature of this sector? If we can't reopen fully ahead of the peak summer season, many businesses will effectively be losing a whole year's worth of revenue.
Mr. Speaker, as long as I've known my honourable friend, he's been an incredible advocate for the small tourism businesses in his constituency, which are a big driver of his local economy. I can assure him I will continue to keep a very close eye, and as we think about exiting from these, look at the right interventions for every sector as we exit from the economic and social restrictions.
Stephanie Peacock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. New research conducted by the Centre for Towns has found that 1 in 3 ex-industrial towns are most economically at risk from COVID-19. Worsbrough, in my constituency, is the 10th town most at risk. What plans does the Treasury have to help areas like mine in Barnsley cope with this crisis and then recover from it?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the significant economic interventions we've put in place will help every part of this country, north or south, rural or urban. That's what they are designed to do. So businesses in her constituency will benefit from all the schemes. But more broadly, the budget set out an ambitious programme of investment in our regions to ensure that opportunity was felt wherever you happen to live in this country, and it's an agenda we remain incredibly committed to.
Robin Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At least one forecast has predicted coastal communities will be hit the hardest by any economic downturn following the COVID-19 crisis. Here in Aberconwy, Llandudno, that queen of resorts, has been singled out as one of those that may well be hardest hit in the UK. Of course, this is further exaggerated by the fact we're still approaching the peak of this crisis here in North Wales. What measures has my right honourable friend put in place to ensure that he will reach that balance between both stimulating our economy and the hospitality trade in particular, and at the same time making sure that that stimulus doesn't come too soon and that we're hit by a second wave here in North Wales?
Chancellor.
Well, Mr. Speaker, this is why it's so vital that we get the timing for this absolutely right. We are not there yet. As the Prime Minister said, we've made good progress, and we all are concerned about the risk of a second peak, and which is why we must meet the 5 tests that the First Secretary set out a little while ago so that we can restart our economy gradually, but with confidence.
Stuart Hosey. Over to Stuart Hosey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I agree with the Chancellor that COVID is causing significant local and global economic problems. And I'm sure he would agree with me that trade will be a vital ingredient in recovery. But let me ask the Chancellor, is it not the case, and should you not take this on board very seriously, that notwithstanding the need to ensure security of supply for things like medicine and medical equipment, that he and his government resist any move, any siren voices pushing the UK towards general protectionism in trade?
The Prime Minister has been completely clear in his commitment to free trade. It's an important part of what we believe. But it is also right that, especially during this time, we can ensure the security of supply that he talked about, and that is what the government is doing. But that requires working with our international partners as well as focusing on domestic sourcing. We can continue to do both things to ensure that especially our workers get all the equipment and supplies they need at this time.
Dr. Andrew Morrison.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Very much welcome the statement, and particularly news about the bounce back loans, which were very helpful for small businesses in my constituency. Selling milk and meat into the non-domestic market has largely stopped, as has farm diversification schemes that are necessary to cross-subsidise land-based business. What more can the Chancellor do beyond that, which he has announced today, to assist agricultural businesses, land-based businesses across the country?
Well, Mr. Speaker, representing a rural constituency myself, I understand very well the comments that my right honourable friend has made. I'm in constant dialogue with the Agriculture Secretary of State on these issues and making sure that all the economic interventions that we put in place can benefit not just the agriculture sector, but as many possible sectors as possible.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Fairs and shows are on the back burner for the summer months. That means that the livelihoods of show families in my constituency are on the line. They purchase rides and equipment through asset finance companies, and they need to cover the repayment costs, which haven't stopped amidst this pandemic. What assurances can the Chancellor give me that the Coronavirus Business Interruption Loan Scheme is offering the funding needed to support travelling fun fairs?
If I understood the question correctly, Mr. Speaker, the Coronavirus Business Interruption Loans do apply to asset leasing already, so it is perfectly possible to use that scheme for a finance arrangement like that. But if that was not the specific question, I'd be happy to answer it in writing.
Kevin Holding-Ray.
Mr. Speaker, can I first declare my business interest, Mr. Speaker, and can I say from a business perspective, can I thank the Chancellor for the excellent work he is doing, which is a view shared widely across the business community. Can I ask about the business interruption loans? I welcome the fact there's a removal of the forward viability test, which is one of the complexities that slows down the current scheme. That's been removed in the new microloan scheme. Will he also commit to looking at removing that from the main scheme as well, which will help to get money out the door much more quickly? Chancellor.
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend has been I wouldn't say a thorn in my side, but a doughty champion of all of those who would like to have access to these loans. And he has made this point forcefully and repeatedly to the Economic Secretary and myself. I'm pleased to tell him we have been working with the banks over the past week or so. And if you will allow me just an extra minute, Mr. Speaker, we have been able to make, on his recommendation, several changes to the scheme, both from the regulatory side, from the PRA and the FCA, to give banks the comfort they need, as well as reassurances from the government. And a statement will be issued shortly by UK Finance confirming that banks will not require the provision of forward-looking financial information or business plans from businesses. I hope that gives him the reassurance he needs. It will give comfort to many businesses, and I congratulate him on making this point so forcefully and effectively over the past week or two.
Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think we all understand that, as the Chancellor said, these schemes were designed at pace. But I have to tell him that here in the Northern Isles, where our economy is predominantly based on small businesses, with every day it becomes more apparent that there are just too many people falling through the gaps, especially the self-employed, people working from home, people relying on directors' dividends for their income. If it is just too difficult to design a scheme to help all these people, will the Treasury now look seriously at the idea of a universal basic income? Yes, it might risk handing cash to people who don't actually need it now, but that can be clawed back through the tax system, and it will give help to people who are getting desperate for it now.
Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, as I've said previously, I don't agree with universal basic income, but I do believe that our schemes benefit many, many millions of people, particularly the self-employed scheme, which will benefit over 3.5 million people who need it. And indeed, the new bounce-back loans I announced today will also be available to those in self-employment with business accounts as well.